one would wonder, what is this PPP? What is the private-public partnership?
Well, so there are a number of definitions when it comes to public-private partnerships. But according to our Public-Private Partnerships Act, which was enacted in 2015, it's a long-term commercial contractual agreement between the private sector and the public sector to be able to deliver a public good or service. Now, the thing about, because the way it's defined in our PPP Act, and I'll use the word PPP because it's much shorter than public-private partnerships, it's defined as a commercial transaction. And we know that where there is private sector or where there is a commercial transaction, we are basically looking at profit maximization. But again, we bring in the component of public, and we know that the public sector is there to provide social welfare, the social good, a public good. And if you know from your simple economics what a public good is, you should be, ideally we are looking at issues of maximizing social welfare, the social interests of citizens. And so that is what makes it then problematic, the issue of PPPs, because how within the same agreement can you be able to meet the interests of both entities without undermining the interests of either of them? So you're maximizing profits, but also you're providing the public good. In the end, there is one that will lose out. And the idea of public-private partnerships, because the reason why countries are increasingly getting into these arrangements is based on an argument that governments do not have money to finance their development. And actually, it gets back, this whole notion around PPP started with the Sustainable Development Goals. Right. And so there was what we call the FFD group, the Financing for Development. There was a meeting in Addis Ababa, and there were discussions about how are we going to finance this these sustainable development goals, because they were defined as ambitious, that governments may not be able to finance the sustainable development goals independently. And we know that in Africa, and specifically in Uganda, we have challenges when it comes to being able to generate the revenue that we need to finance our development. Right. But and so the proposal was that governments can leverage on private finance, because the argument is that the private sector are the ones that have the money. And if you've been following the development strategies of Uganda, you realize that increasingly there is a focus on allowing the private sector to be the engines of development. And so our national development plans look at putting private sector at the center of development. Now, when we're talking about private sector, then the question comes, what private sector? Because it's definitely not our own homegrown private sector. They do not have the financing. So it's the private sector that are coming from outside. Because, again, our countries have this notion or strategy of promoting and attracting foreign direct investments. Now, aside from the fact that there is need for financing, there was also a challenge that increasingly aid was reducing. Okay. That the amount of money we're getting in form of aid, in form of grants was reducing, that the traditional donors were reducing on the amount of money that they were giving us to be able to finance our development. And then there comes the whole debt issue. But with reduced aid and changes within the aid architecture, these traditional lenders, so like for example the World Bank, increasingly have increasingly started to encourage our governments to get into PPPs. Now, what makes it really interesting and very saddening is the fact that you realize that these, the so-called private entities, so I'll give the example of the recent case of the Lumonya hospital. We all heard about the Lumonya hospital and how government had gotten into a PPP with a company called Finansi, and that they were going to be the ones to handle the development of this project. Now, this company, Finansi, had gotten, was given promissory notes by the government of Uganda through the Ministry of Finance. And it took these promissory notes to the World Bank for financing. Now, aside from that, there are other arrangements where the private entity comes in. It has a good concept, an interesting concept, but all it needs is a guarantee from the government. Once it gets the guarantee, then it goes to financiers like the World Bank, it goes to financiers like the African Development Bank for financing to be able to come and then execute the project. And the reason why I'm bringing out this scenario is that when it comes to the PPP arrangement, the argument that public sector can be able to leverage on private financing is questionable, because private sector does not actually have the financing, whether it is domestic or it is foreign. Because these are entities that are coming to our governments. They get promissory notes, they get guarantees, they get all these different, I'll basically sum them into one word, those guarantees, that the government will be able to, that in case of any challenges, the government can be able to step in. So they are going to the same lenders, the same entities from which our governments used to borrow, have always borrowed and still borrow, to be able to get this money. Now, why that then is challenging is that when you're lending to a private entity compared to lending to a government, the interest rates are totally different, because the private entity is more likely to default compared to a public entity. So, I mean, in the case of Uganda, if we defaulted, of which, I mean, there are so many governments. We've seen countries like Argentina default on a number of their loans. So as entities, we can be able to default because you're not going to, as a country, you're not going to go anywhere. This entity can still get its money after some time. But also, the countries have certain, like, so for example, in the case of Kenya, which is a very also disturbing scenario. We've seen, for example, the Chinese government, but that's really a specific government lending. We've seen the Chinese government wanting, and I don't know if this has happened, I need to cross-check my information, wanting to take over Mombasa port.
It's happened.
Yes. So you see that in the case of, for example, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, we can be able to default. But also when it comes to the interest rates that would be given in case of a loan, it would be much lower. But when it comes to a private entity, the interest rates are much higher. And it's no wonder that research shows that projects implemented through PPPs cost twice as much as compared to if it had been, if the financing had directly been given to a public entity, and would have been implemented through the private entity. Right. So, and there are a number of arguments for PPPs. Aside from the financing, there are issues to do with the fact that private sector has new and improved technology. There are issues to do with the fact that the private sector is more efficient. And because when you talk about efficiency, when you talk about efficiency, it then raises questions about what kind of governments we have as African countries. Because if you would want to give a project to a private entity because they are more efficient than you, then what are you doing in office?
Why PPP? Like you said that earlier on, why not just give the money to the public sector or the private sector and they work independently? Why this particular model?
Thank you very much. And I think it's good that you bring back that question of why. And to respond to it, I will take us back to the 1990s. So 1980s, 1990s. So what happens is that around that time we were having challenges with economic restructuring, getting out of the war and the effects it had had on our economy, but also this different restructuring was happening not only in Uganda but also across the African continent. And you will recall that before that time we had cooperatives that were functional. Yes. We had marketing boards, producer cooperatives. We were and I think until about, when did NITIL completely sort of collapse? Before government then put in money, we had Ginger, those bed sheets, and all of us used to have bed sheets made by NITIL, and they even had a small brand on them, and you knew that if someone was putting on Ginger, it was because it was coming from that particular place. But basically, government was somehow in control. Yes. Of the way the economy was running, before the role of the state. Exactly. So then we get into IMF and World Bank, then convince us to get into, to adopt a structure adjustment program. And at that time we needed money to be able to sort out a number of things. And with these loans coming in from IMF and World Bank, they came with conditions. And the conditions were that, number one, you need to privatize your parastatals. So that's how we saw Uganda Electricity Board go. We saw Uganda Commercial Bank go. We saw a number of public parastatals. We saw a lot of parastatals being privatized. And then another condition was that you need to liberalize. You need to reduce on regulating what is coming in and what is going out. And then that is how we started to import a lot of products, a lot of the products that we have the capacity to produce. Yes. And it was with the whole notion of free trade, that if you adopt free trade, then you will be more competitive. You focus on where your comparative advantage is, and then you'll be able to produce where you have higher comparative advantage, and then buy from that one who is producing where they have a higher comparative advantage. And then the other was deregulate. Deregulate was basically reduce on the amount of regulation. So for example, issues to do with setting prices, stop setting prices, and all those different issues. And that is where we lost the role of the state. Now I want to focus a lot more on privatization. And basically this whole issue of PPPs is anchored within that particular strategy of privatization. And like I said, it's focusing on enhancing the role of private sector in development. Now, the big question is, what kind of private sector? And I think that is where then I start to respond to your second question about whether it's working. Yes, please. When you look at the PPP Act, for example, one of the areas where we think it falls short is that it's not clear when it comes to issues of local content, when it comes to issues of of engaging the local entrepreneurs. And that's where the challenge comes in, because for you to be able to partner with government in something, it's almost impossible as a local entrepreneur, because of these different conditions that have been put in place in terms of for example, the financing requirements. There are certain arrangements, there are certain PPPs that have been implemented with like, for example, small hospitals, say levels of health center 3s. So government is putting money in some of those, and those are some kind of PPPs where government is putting money in these hospitals. Now that one has also faced challenges in terms of regulation, because again, government will finance, say, testing for a particular health need. So for example, you will go and you can be able to get free malaria testing. But then when it comes to, say, for example, a condition that needs a scan, you may not be able to get it for free because government is not covering that particular area. So even when it comes to those small arrangements, there are concerns when in as far as the implementation is concerned, because the regulation is not as effective. But then because when we talk about local content and involvement of the local entrepreneurs or local suppliers, we are looking at these big projects. So for example, in the case of the Kampala-Entebbe Express Highway, yes, there was a lot of money that was sunk into that particular project. And the Chinese built that road, right, and they came here with workers even to the level of, I am driving a tractor, and the argument is that we don't have individuals that can be able to operate a tractor, but these are skills that could be transferred to Ugandans. So for example, if the government of Uganda knew that we are going to construct this road, what is the impact plan in terms of citizens? Because a lot of money, and this is a loan that we have to pay. Yes. We've not yet started paying it, because the argument is that we are supposed to pay it from the fees, yes, the toll fees that will be collected. But because of arguments such as there is no legal framework to help enforce collection of tolls on that road, the money cannot be collected yet. But also when you look at the amount of traffic on the road, it's questionable about whether we'll be able to raise that money. Yes. So the fact that these projects come in and government has not made an extensive development plan then creates a challenge, because if you're getting into a PPP with such a project, into a PPP to implement such a project, it's important that there are clear plans of skills transfer, but also issues to do with technology transfer, because those guys came with computers that were in Chinese. Yes. How many of them were left behind? And then issues to do with how locals can participate in supplying. The kind of individuals that we use in these projects. So for example, like the Chinese, one of the concerns that have been raised by people, for example, in Hoima, is that these guys, you cannot even supply them with food, because even the food, they seem to come with it. Yes. So the local economy does not exactly benefit from some of these arrangements.
Interesting. Could you give us some picture into these particular risks?
Thank you very much, Tush. So I think one of the things that I didn't mention at the beginning, yes, was that the purpose of public-private partnership, PPPs, is for these two entities to be able to share risks. And it's one of the reasons why the private sector are increasingly growing interest in PPP arrangements, because they know that they can be able that the risk involved in the investment can be buttressed by another entity, which is the public sector. So we are looking at scenarios where, for example, if I am putting up a hospital and I have estimated that I should be able to collect a revenue of about, say, 200 million within say a month. Let me give it a month, and at the end of it, I am unable to actually collect that 200 million. And I'm at about 100 million. In that case, government, the public entity, would come in to compensate for that particular loss that has been made. So the risk then is covered in that sense. So because we've seen, for example, scenarios like umeme, and I know that the conversation around PPPs came out into the public years after umeme had actually come into play.
Right.
But the umeme arrangement is actually a PPP. And one of the things highlighted in their contract with the government of Uganda is that if they are unable to recoup their investment capital, then government of Uganda would have to compensate them. And that agreement actually highlights a number of compensation requirements. That even when government decides to cancel, to terminate the contract, they would have to compensate umeme. If government of Uganda decided if the two entities agreed to terminate the contract, government of Uganda would still have to compensate umeme. Yes. And then if there was a disaster and they list a number of disasters, government of Uganda would have to compensate umeme. So you realize that, for example, if there are issues to do with disasters, if there are issues to do with financial risks, if there are performance risks, if all kinds of risks, the public entity would have to cover up, to cater for that particular risk. So then the question is, okay, if we are talking about sharing risk, who is actually bearing the entire risk?
Government is working through the Uganda National Oil Company to engage the other stakeholders into efficient oil exploration in the country.
Because for a PPP contract must be signed. Yes. So the government of Uganda, and in this case it would be the Ministry of Energy, would sign a PPP contract with the private entity, which is Total E&P, and then agree that they will be able to share the risks involved, they will be able to share the profits involved.
Then it is, because those are some of the things they're working upon. Okay.
Because again, now maybe just to pick up from the issue that you raised about these entities partnering, because there are issues to do with sharing risk, but there are also issues to do with sharing profits.
Yes, please.
Now the challenge with our PPP Act is that it includes a provision around disclosure, non-disclosure of information.
Right.
And then that information is not extensively defined, because there is a lot of information involved when it comes to any kind of partnership. And we are looking at information, for example, around profits, around costs involved. Now, if there are concerns about disclosure of information, it then creates concerns around the transparency issue and accountability. Because if there are profits that are being controlled by the private entity, because they are the ones controlling the finances, how much is coming in, how much is being sold, etc., etc. How does government guarantee that the information being shared, for example, in as far as profits are concerned, is actually the information being shared? We've seen entities like, for example, and I'll constantly give the example of umeme, because Umeme has also had challenges registering a number of losses and
Right.
indicating that they are not making the profits that they intended to make. But if there is issues to do with non-disclosure of information, how then is that particular scenario handled? Yeah, and those are some of the concerns that we have had. And but also you look at, for example, issues to do with the cost of the service provided, because this private entity is also reserves the right yeah, like, okay, let me say that right,
Yes.
to set the price
Okay.
at which it will sell this particular product. So in the case of Umeme, we've seen that government cannot be able to say that, you know what, cut down on the tariffs. And we, as consumers, we have continued to suffer with very high tariffs, and you're paying more than 1,000 Uganda shillings per unit, which is ridiculous. But this is something that government cannot alter, and that is where the challenge of PPPs then comes in, because if you are two parties and one of them is working for the interest of the other, then there should be a way in which this particular operation can be influenced to ensure that the service that is provided is as affordable as possible.
Right.
Issues to do with health. We know that Uganda has one of the highest out-of-pocket expenses. And Ministry of Finance puts it at about 50%. So if you go to a hospital for medical care, the amount of money that you have to pull out of your pocket, to pay for health care service is very, very high. And yet, with government getting into these PPP arrangements, and they are not regulating the operations of a particular hospital, of a particular health center, the cost of the service has remained very high on a lot of services, healthcare services that are provided.
Give me what you would call your closing remarks for this particular segment today.
Yeah, I think this is a conversation that needs to continue, because
Yes,
a lot of people do not know about PPPs, because when it's often discussed, especially by government or the private entities, it's or even the World Bank and African Development Bank, it's always sugar-coated to make it seem like it's a viable venture, that it's an ideal financing strategy. But it comes with a lot of challenges that need to be looked into, and we do not want the scenario or the experience that we are going through because of the structural adjustment programs to happen to us, because we got into PPPs because we were told that they are ideal for financing our development. So I think my final remarks would basically be that government needs to look into this particular arrangement more with a human face, look at it from putting the citizens at the center, that if I get into this arrangement, will people be able to get the service at the least available cost? But also, most importantly, looking at how do we engage local entrepreneurs to benefit, because it's one thing to have huge investments happening, but they are leaving the local economy the same as what they came. Issues to do with skills transfer, issues to do with technology transfer, that if a private entity is coming in, there should be a requirement that they should partner with local entrepreneurs and ensure that they are benefiting. And then issues to do with transparency and accountability. It's very, very important, because PPPs have an impact. The way a PPP is designed impacts on the extent to which the project will deliver, but also it impacts on the economy in terms of the indebtedness, in terms of the entire health of the economy.